Well, welcome, everyone. It's my privilege, but really it's my joy to welcome you to the Eason Weinmann Lecture in International and Comparative Law. This is always a momentous occasion, truly. It's as one of our marquee events in the intellectual life of our law school, and as a jewel of one of the signature academic programs for Tulane Law School. But this year, this is even more momentous than usual, because this is our very first event, our first public lecture or event of any kind, aside from graduation last year, that we are allowed to hold since the pandemic arrived in March of 2020, so in more than 17 months. So it is really a special joy to be able to gather again together in this room. Thank you so much for being here and sort of re-inaugurating the return of our sort of full, more normal intellectual life. This is, speaking of the significance of this event for Tulane in international comparative law, it is, many of you will know, but not all, as far back as the 19th century, Tulane University's first president, William Preston Johnson, hailed the science of comparative jurisprudence as the defining strength of Tulane Law School, the thing that set it apart from all other American law schools. And today, of course, in the age of globalization, every law school in the country and the world is clamoring to claim an international identity and pedigree. But at Tulane, this goes back to our very beginning. In fact, the first two lectures delivered at Tulane Law School in 1847, before most other American law schools yet existed, were one in admiralty law and the second in comparative law. So this is part of our lifeblood from our very beginning. But yet it took leadership and vision to nurture and develop that identity through to this present day. And since 1981, Tulane's leadership in international and comparative law has been expressed and extended through the identity of the Eason Weinmann Center for International and Comparative Law, which was established through the generosity of Ambassador John Giffen Weinmann and his wife, Virginia Eason Weinmann. Ambassador Weinmann built an extraordinarily distinguished career on the international stage, first as a partner for more than 3 decades, or I think almost 3 decades, with the distinguished New Orleans law firm of Phelps Dunbar, and then as president of Waverly Oil Corporation, and finally as U.S. ambassador to Finland, and later as chief of protocol in the White House. Ambassador and Mrs. Weinmann each served in important leadership roles in higher education. Ambassador Weinmann here is the president of Tulane University's Board of Administrators, and Mrs. Weinmann as a member, a trustee of her own alma mater, Connecticut College. The impact of Ambassador and Mrs. Weinmann's generosity extends beyond the important and generous financial support they provided, not just for the center, but the Eason Weinmann Chair, our new Center for Energy Law, of course, this magnificent building that bears their name, but also through their personal support and faithful attendance at this lecture over many, many years. Ambassador Weinmann passed away now 5 years ago in 2016. But of course, his legacy lives on in this building through all of these things that he and Mrs. Weinmann have so generously supported with their vision and through the years. So I just want to always on this occasion acknowledge the importance of their support and the depth of our gratitude to them. And with that, I will now turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Vernon Palma, the Thomas Pickles Chair in Law, to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Okko Behrens. And I will put on my mask.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everyone. I wanted to say, in addition to what the Dean just said, welcome. It is really great to see a live audience once again. Our speaker tonight is quite renowned. He has devoted his entire academic career to the passionate study of Roman law and legal history, earning many honors and a worldwide reputation. The Eason Weinmann Center is pleased and privileged to have such a renowned scholar deliver our annual lecture. Professor Dr. Behrens has a long and fruitful relationship with Goettingen University, his alma mater, founded in 1730, a little before us. He received his first doctorate there, as well as his second doctorate, or habilitation. And from 1975 until his retirement in 2007, he was professor of civil law, Roman law, and modern legal history. Following in the footsteps, I think, of one of the world's greatest professors ever of the 19th century, Rudolf von Jhering, who was also at Göttingen. Through all these years, Professor Behrens directed the Institute of Roman and Civil Law, and later he founded the Institute of Legal History, Legal Philosophy, and Legal Comparison in 2005. He also served as Dean of the Law Faculty and then Vice President of the university. Stockholm University added to his laurels when it made him a Doctor Honoris Causa in 2009. His third doctorate, I believe, if I count correctly. But Dr. Behrens did not merely stay in Göttingen. He traveled extensively, lecturing at universities in the United States, at Cornell, where he was, I believe, the A.D. White Professor at Large, at Pennsylvania, where I believe he was the Bach Professor of Law. In Italy, he taught at the renowned La Sapienza in Rome, also in Naples at the Federico II, in France at the Université Montesquieu at Bordeaux, in China at Nanjing University, and also East China University in Shanghai, where he enjoys the title of honorary professor. And in Shanghai, I happened to meet Professor Behrens. Well, now it's Tulane's turn to hear him lecture. He is with us at a faculty where, as the Dean has already mentioned, the civil law and the Roman law are central pillars of the academic mission, and where his deep knowledge of Roman law is highly relevant. He's been teaching for 2 weeks a short course here at Tulane to our students called The Permanence of Roman Law in the Modern World. Professor Behrens' publications are just too numerous to summarize, too numerous to go into in detail. Four monographs, a prodigious number of articles, and important translations. The focus in his writings, like the focus of his lecture tonight, explores the relationship between, on the one hand, law as a social reality that guides human behavior, and on the other hand, the philosophical thought and inquiry attempting to explain the human condition. The Roman law of antiquity, as you will see, still furnishes him with a rich field in which to explore this relationship. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Emeritus Dr. Okko Behrens of Goettingen.
Thank you very much for this kind presentation and the kind invitation especially. And I must at once say that it was highly inspiring to be able to prepare this lecture and also what I had to teach in this course you mentioned, because it is extremely inspiring to be able to do it in the only state of the United States where there is still a living civil law tradition. And I have learned that it is really important in the field of contract and tort law, where the French, Spanish, Roman tradition is very notable. So I can only repeat that it is and it was a great privilege, and it had some time to be realized, because I think the first idea that I will come to this place is more than 6 years ago. And sometimes you said even that the gods have something against my coming here. But now it seems that the gods have now given their consent. And let me now start to, of course, read my prepared paper. But I must add also, this paper has been written at Göttingen, but I am very grateful for essentially important suggestions as to refine still a little bit the text. So may I now start with my contribution. The spirit of the Roman law that needs re-evaluation is the one conjured by the great Rudolf von Jhering, whose contributions to jurisprudence have justly affirmed his standing as one of the most important legal minds ever. Born in East Frisia in 1818, he died in Göttingen in 1892 at the age of 74. Often cited as the father of the sociological jurisprudence, he is even sometimes referred to as a semigod. His immense merits are beyond doubt, but his interpretation of the spirit of Roman law in his work, The Spirit of the Roman Law of the Different Stages of its Development, the title of which follows Montesquieu de l'Esprit des Lois, The Spirit of Laws, ended as a grandiose failure. A stranded venture in 4 splendid volumes, a shipwreck with a work that had become at the end, as he confessed himself, his tormentor, his Quälgeist, a tormenting spirit that had not ceased to torture and tantalize him. The great undertaking, initiated at the very beginning of his academic career, got in fact stuck. Jhering had explicitly planned to an analysis of the spirit of the Roman law in the different stages of its development, but he never fulfilled the promise contained in the title of the central work. He never reached the scientific period where he would have met the great individuals and the extended literature, and last but not least, the decisive witness of the most crucial time in Rome's history, Cicero. His failure was hidden by the way he enthroned at the end the Roman jurist as the great prefiguration of all lawyers to come. He did it with words which surely are among the most influential ever spoken in the realm of law. It was a resonating cry for freedom that drew its extraordinary power from the dramatic, deeply felt turnabout in the intellectual career of this extraordinary legal mind. Jhering was, in the beginning, a fanatic of concepts. In his own intensely self-critical account, he confessed that in those days he trumped everyone else in his belief in the absolute validity of the legal concept found in the Roman tradition and the strict duty to accept them with all their apparent logical consequences. Then came a case that served as an eye-opener and compelled him at the end, under the dictate of his legal conscience, after a long internal struggle, to reverse his attitude. From that day on, it was, as he tells the story in New Year's Eve, law became, as the English title of his other great work tells us, a means to an end, determined not by form, but by purpose. It was a view no longer dependent on the special authority of the Roman law. Roman law was accordingly displaced from the center. The cry I mentioned, in which he adjured his former belief, was in fact a sort of farewell to the study of the important conceptual side of Roman law. The new center was life itself and its necessities. The words he spoke are famous. Life is made not for the sake of concepts, but concepts are made for the sake of life. Not what logic, but what life, business transaction, the sense of justice demands, has to happen. The sentence has a clear biblical ring that is unmistakably present. The Sabbath was made for men, not men for the Sabbath. It is followed by an argument that captured and impressed everyone. The Roman lawyers, Jürgen says, would have been utter fools and mere pupils incapable of independent judgment if they had thought otherwise. Not only admirer of Roman law, no jurist wants to appear as a childlike fool. In Jherin's new insight, notions have no longer any intrinsic value. They are now, in his words, not real money, just arithmetic pennies, which can help to count, but without really counting. Those pennies were coin-like medals produced across Europe from the 13th century through the 18th. They were produced only as counter for use in calculation on a counting board, a line board similar to an abacus. They were no money at all. Under the impression of this powerful declaration and illustration that seemingly summed up a deep acquaintance with the spirit of Roman law, no Romanist dared once and dares today to contest the seemingly deep truths proclaimed by the second Jhering. No Roman jurist ever relied on concepts because, being real lawyers, they were able to discern the just and equitable in life itself. And since Roman law, at least in the lifetime of Jhering, was still seen as the incarnation of law itself, Jhering's proclamation had an enormous impact also on the theory of law in general. The founder of the jurisprudence of interest, Philip Heck, revered him as his godfather. Also, Oliver Wendell Holmes' famous statement in the beginning of his central work, Common Law, that runs, the life of law has not been logic, it has been experience, is indebted to Jhering, whom he acknowledged as his equal. He cites in this book Jhering's Spirits of the Roman Law in its French translation and calls Jhering a man of genius. Its purest, most radical, at the end most harmful realization of found Jhering's vigorous rejection of the ordering power of consent in the free law movement, whose freedom is exactly the freedom reclaimed in Jhering's outcry. But like epigons tend to do, the free law adherents handled it without any restraints. No concept was allowed to hinder what the necessities of life have come to power required in concrete situations. And since the necessities of power of life interpreting law are determined by politics, it is altogether consequential that the law taught in the Third Reich was definitely and explicitly free law. No written law should and could hinder the realization of the politics that had in those days come to power. Jhering, for his part, confessed in a famous instance that he was still way too much a jurist formed by the Pandects and Roman law to join their excesses. When a famous early torchbearer of this movement extolled Portia's argument in The Merchant of Venice as a model of free law, he replied that if such reasoning would be permitted, a judge could take away a right of way easement because the contract that granted it did not expressly allow the entitled person to leave footprints in the soil burdened by the easement. It was an important statement. Jhering admitted thereby that his famous word from his first period, never taken back, Form is a twin sister of liberty and the sworn enemy of the arbitrary, applies also to the correct use of entitling notions and the necessities of clear distinction. A contract can be void because it violates good morals, such as the pound of flesh provision. But if a contract is valid, the right it confers contains necessarily what is implicit for its use or exercise. And if we evaluate Järing's work of his second period, all in all, we find an endeavor to lay the foundations of a law centered around the freedom of the socially interacting human person and the professional quest for the same sound equilibrium between the necessity of legal certainty and allowance for concrete value judgment that is inherent in Roman law. But it was not Järing's later work, but his cry for freedom of the bondage of formal concepts that formed the methodological convictions of the many leading jurists relating to him. It resulted in a huge general iconoclasm, including also of one of the finest observations Järing made in his first period, when, following in the footsteps of Savigny, he correctly described with great admiration that the Roman tradition treats private law not as commands, but as a system of institutional entitlements or subjective rights, an attitude that he convincingly called higher jurisprudence, a flattering name for all lawyers because their professional view when helping their clients cannot avoid looking on their rights in need of protection. It was an insight that more or less faded into oblivion, so that as an influential legal socialist tried to construe property as a set of commands directed at everybody else who respected. A highly unprofessional view which does not allow a proper understanding and visualizing neither of transfer of property nor of its encumbrances with a lien or an easement. A central reason for this lack of success was that it built already in Järing's first period a foreign element with no genetic explanation. Montesquieu and Savigny, the founder of the historical law school, had both perfectly realized that the Roman law was a spiritual fruit of the Roman Republic. Montesquieu demonstrated it with his famous teaching of the separation of powers, which is an adaptation of the mixed constitution in which the Romans took pride. Savigny did it when he taught that Roman law was a creation of the Roman free state and requires for a correct understanding the distinction between the technical element in the hands of the jurist and the political element in which it bears its fruits for the entitled citizen. He criticized those who didn't understand that property is a concept of high political importance. But Järing had started his spirit of the Roman law from a profoundly different conception. He was the pupil of the most important, but in this point, profoundly disloyal pupil of Savigny, named George Frederick Puchter. Järing met this rigorous pedagogist in Berlin in 1842, when Puchter was nominated Savigny's successor. Puchter no longer looked at the Roman Republic for the founding principles of the law, but to the Old Testament and Adam's divine empowerment by God, treating it as a model for everyone's subjective rights. Every human person, without exception, appeared in this view as an heir of Adam, and as such entitled to a part of the goods of this world, insofar attributed to him by the concept of law. Järing, who dedicated his spirit of Roman law to Puchter, adopted this Adamitic view and deduced from it that the divinely empowered individual can with its will transform pure factual possession into property without any worldly legal order validating the claim. Giving to it a slightly secularized version, he introduced therewith the highly influential self-help theory. Still today, it allows many legal historians to think that Roman private law does not need in its beginning any assistance from constitutional law because it's essentially the creation of human will. The Adamite person is by its origin clearly elder than the state and at the same time completely independent, as in the feudal times the noble knights who relied for what they had and wanted to have they relied only on God and their rights, claiming in French, Dieu et mon droit. The anthropology behind this concept describes an isolated being dependent on its own will, but divinely empowered. The heuristic medium of this empowerment is seen where Puchter invented a mysterious genealogy of concepts able to attribute to an individual all the entitlements, that is, the subjective rights that the Roman law contained. It was this invention that brought the young Jähring to the belief that the Roman sources offer a high jurisprudence whose notions had to be adhered to with utmost rigor. With this turnabout, Jähring rejected this belief and banished it, often with the zeal of a convert, but he did not distance himself from the theory of self-help, which on the contrary got a new momentum because of the inner kinship it has with this methodological conviction that replaced his lost trust of the concepts. That is the belief that life itself contains information about what is just and unjust, that will lead our legal judgment to the best decisions. Indeed, in both instances, in self-help and decision-making, the will of an individual confronting a real situation is empowered by the certitude that for an inspired person, life offers the possibility to discover and to do what is right. It is a belief that has a certain affinity with subjective idealism that at first tried to develop a law of its own making without any professional aid, and left in its latest form in modern existentialism no place for law at all. It is testament, thank you. It is testament to the enormous influence Jähring's spirit of the Roman law still exerts, with its eremitic beginning and its abrupt and brusque end, rejecting logic, that self-help and decision-making by inspired intuition are still dominant in current literature. You will find them in all places where a Romanist tries to explain the origin of the phenomenon of Roman private law. It seems to be a law without any pre-existing objectivity, real and admirable only when seen in action. Confronted with this explanation, whose roots have nothing to do with antiquity, there is help only in following the advice of Montesquieu, who had famously said, "One must always go back to the Romans. Il faut toujours revenir aux Romains," and take it in its full sense and visit the Romans in their real history, where they acted as persons of our species, not less endowed than we are, and with the immense privilege to do certain things, not least in the field of law, for the first time. This has been done in the meantime for quite a while at my university at Göttingen, sometimes working reverently at the desk of Jähring, which had accompanied his entire academic life and is now a treasure of the Göttingen Institute of Roman Law. The result of these studies was that we can nowadays ascertain with certitude the exact contrary of what the mainstream thinks under the influence of Jähring's turnabout about the origin of Roman law. Roman law was characterized in all its stages by its objectivity, by its capability to give to human existence a meaningful pre-existing order, guaranteeing human freedom and human cooperation. Let me look at the stages of its development, therefore. The first stage was dominated by a religion that saw in realized law continuously creating social peace the central means of worship of the divine. It was by far the most important. The enduring presence of this so-called augural religion in Roman legal thinking allowed in two following periods, the second and the third stage, the incorporation of two important Hellenistic legal philosophies into a professional jurisprudence, a transformation impossible in their Greek homeland. The first already at the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ in form of the reception of the doctrines of the Stoa, and then in Cicero's use of the doctrines of the Third Skeptical Academy, finally refined by the central place it gave to the art of the philosophically educated orator. It later enabled Augustus, the last stage, whose constitution called Principate formed the last stage of the development of Roman law, to admit the coexistence of two competing imperial law schools, one favoring the Stoic tradition, the other favoring the skeptical tradition, under the idea, Augustus did it under the idea that both are united by the quest for the best law. Finally, its creed that administrating and cultivating the law means worship of the divine allowed the Christian communities to accept the Roman law as an expression of the divine will that the world was created to last. A profound change of mind that permitted the Emperor Constantine to elevate Christianity to a privileged religion, and finally Justinian to codify the Roman law as a creation of the Trinity, of the Holy Spirit, he called holy wisdom. As a creative principle of law, this spiritual force operated, as Justinian ascertained in the preamble of his codification, with great emphasis exclusively in the Roman history. The augural religion, and exclusively Roman creed, was a product of the so-called Neolithic revolution, that is, the beginning of agriculture, and born out of the conviction that the radical change of nature that substituted woodland and shrubberies by clean arable land requires the help of the divinity of light and order revered in the clear sky. It was from the beginning a profoundly legal or law-like religion because it was founded on the conviction that reverence of this divinity had to be done by offering to it constantly the aspect of a peaceful and well-ordered community. The power to create such a settlement was in the hand of a charismatic king. To attain the desired aspect of the community, this priestly king at first surveyed the territory in a cosmical sky-reflecting way from a center, the Alps, situated in the middle of it and prepared to receive the homes of the settlers. He then assigned to each settler a portion of the arable soil, defined by solemnly marked out and religiously protected boundaries, because situated in a divinely purified land. Its result was the vindication model, the lasting backbone of Rome's societal order, guaranteeing every settler freedom and property in its largest possible sense. The vindication model that protected the freedom and property of the settler was the immediate result of the collective labor expended in the clearing the land by recompensing each settler for his part in the work. The freedom expressing the rightful membership was vindicated by Latin vindicere, that initially had to be pronounced by the king himself. The property by Latin vindicare, whose words were spoken by the settler. The central figure of this model is the ven or win, an Indo-European word for friend, like in German Winfried, friend of peace. And in this context, the individual settler. The central quality of the vindication model is jus, which originally means the absence of any dispute and quarrel affecting the peaceful purity of the model. Its result is called Pax et venia Deum, the peace and blessing of natural forces called Dei, responsible for the growth of the grain and of all the other natural processes that determine the welfare of the settlement. The belief that peaceful order attained and sustained with the help of the revered skylight will strengthen the respective forces and increase their yields is the core of the augural religion, present in the verb augere, increase, enlarge, make, grow, and its derivatives, auctoritas and augustus. In the vindication model, each settler worked independently, and there was consequently also envy when a neighbor did better, and even in the oldest time, suspicion that he might have used some magical device to make his crop so rich. It is an important indication because it is testament to the fact that the vindication model contained no trace of collectivism or collective ownership. The visibility and objectivity felt presence of this model was upheld by the strictly oral forms in which the assertions and confirmations of rights were expressed. The procedure was always a little staged scene in which the texts were prescribed and all phases intent on pacifying the element of the model touched by a dispute. The jurisdiction required dies fasti, days exempt of any impurity which could hinder the divine power exerted by the king. It proceeded uniquely in wording that knew of no command. The famous three words of this oral jurisdiction, the tria verba, that made the Emperor Claudius stutter, do, dico, adico, I grant, I declare, I assent, are all declarations that bestow or confirm roles and subjective rights of the vindication model. Its character is very well described by Livy's word, praising an exemplary Roman king. He maintained order over the places in ownership with authority, not with command. Auctoritate magis quam imperio regebat loca. The Greek called the word auctoritas, authority, untranslatable, and with good reason, because it is rooted in the highly special augural religion unknown to their tradition. Auctoritas has, wherever it is used with legal importance, auctoritas patrum, auctoritas tutoris, auctoritas principis, essentially a strengthening power of peaceful law, whereas imperium initially means exclusively the military command, which was not admitted, rather rigorously excluded, where the peaceful law of the vindication model had to be protected. The enduring success of this model was possible because it became the legal order of the Roman citizen called Quirites. The name refers to a union of about 20 settlements united by the cult of Quirinus Pater, worshipped on the hill still named Quirinale, and represented by the patres of the Senate, each of them endowed with potential regal, that is, peaceful power to keep up the vindication model of the citizens. In the oral sceneries of litigation and adjudication, the change could be seen by the fact that freedom and property were now qualified by the ending ex iure quiritium, according to the law of the Quirites. Freedom was from now on called liberum ex iure quiritium, property suum, or beum ex iure quiritium. Both were reflecting a peaceful and fruitful order held to be present in an objective way. The great and comprehensive statute called the Law of the 12 Tables, enacted in the middle of the 5th century BC, represents the adaptation of the vindication model to the necessities of a commercial town, extending in property law the necessities extending in property the freedom of disposal in conveying property, especially on landed property, creating entitling servitudes for the benefits of building, and refining the already existing law of obligation. It was intellectually the work of a new powerful urban priesthood, the pontiffs, not the augurs, who, under the supervision of the great pontiff, were expert of the augural rules to be observed when the voting assemblies came together. Now the next stage, the Stoic. The Stoic period enhanced the felt presence of law as the ordering medium of life. This great and long period is referred to when Seneca said in a letter to his counterpart, "I want you to remember that our believing ancestors were Stoics." They appear at the beginning of the 3rd century when the Pontifical College was open to the plebeians, townspeople in those days oriented to the Hellenistic world. Immediately represented by great figures, the Pontiff Sempronius the Wise, Sempronius Zophos, whose wisdom, as the Greek cognomen Zophos tells us, is of Greek origin, and the great Pontiff Coruncanius, who with enduring success elevated law to a matter of public education, which can be very intensely presented in literature. In Stoic belief, it is divine providence that enables men to be instrumental in the creation of statehood, because in the multitude of all the meaningful possibilities providence has created and is continuously creating to be realized by human action, it has also created the possibility that men can organize mankind into a multitude of republics, distinct by the different proper laws, but united by an universal law protecting all of its members. These states are seen as bodies made up of individuals separate and independent bodies, corpora ex distantibus, in Greek soma ex dies sortum. And as a house or a ship, composite bodies will in this view be the closer to perfection the more it realizes divine possibilities. The same holds true for the body politic, made up of separate individuals, only that it is in this case much more difficult to reach even a decent approximation. In the case of the Roman majores, as they were told, of these jurists, taught a system, and it has handed down to us by Cicero, who had studied with their last representatives, had proudly realized all its requirements, its retentiveness and its universalism. They retained and developed with great diligence and care the jus creatium codified by the 12 tables as a written law valid only for the Romans and held to be the everywhere necessary first step to statehood, but completed it with a universal civil law, that jus civile, that renders Greek nomos politikos, unwritten, but for people endowed with real insight, recognizable as an essential feature of a state eager to come closer to perfection, a perfection that demands a state not only there for the interest of its citizen, but also for the benefit of the fraction of mankind that happens to be on its soil. The mayores found themselves privileged because, differing from the lawgivers of Athens and Sparta, who were censured as being short-sighted and thoughtless, because they believed against all evidence that for the freedom of a great people, statutory law can be sufficient. The Decemviri, the legislator of the 12 tables, were exempt of such criticism and were seen as wise because because of the entitling vindication model present in all their rulings. The tendency to promote freedom of disposal in the sense of conveying property in the great Republican statute were by them ingeniously intensified by using its word literally to construe the famous nachgeformte Rechtsgeschäfte, which means transactions shamed in the old mold. The formal cash sale of the statute was transformed into a one-penny sale that allowed donations and many other dispositions transferring rights in the vindication model, granting to Roman citizens, with the help of a shrewdly used formality, an extraordinary amount of what can already justly be called private autonomy. The universal law was no less in favor of this freedom of disposal and offered in the realm of entitlements, property, and formal contracts whatever reflection inspired by the vindication model could suggest as reasonable. But the greatest innovation was the principle of trust, fides, that required no form and was seen as a providential principle that governed every social relationship in which a human interest was put into the hands of another person, whether in sale, hire, loan, tutorship, or in numerous other guns. And it was no less consequential when such an interest was given in the hand of a state authority. Under the pontificate of Coronacanius, the second one I named, consul 280 and died about 243, this providential force, Fides, got her own temple on Capitol Hill, alongside the temple of Jupiter, now seen as a god of universal and particular civic liberty, for whose provision the city-states of the world are founded. The social life built up by the human tendency to bring to fruition in special relationships governed by trust all that an individual has and can in the multiple relations of social life was seen as a providential substitute of the initial solidarity imputed by the Stoics to a lost golden age. It was the birth of good faith and her long history that at the end became turbulent and as such a central fact for the understanding of the third and fourth period of Roman law. In its first long reign, fides, trustworthiness, was expected when the particular relationship was brought about by an informal promise. But the human faithfulness engaged in such a promise was seen as ambiguous. It became good faith only when proven, that is, when the vendor has delivered the thing or the buyer paid the price. In case of non-fulfillment, the oral action formulated accordingly, that I may not be deceived and defrauded through you and your trustworthiness. It was a doubtful trustworthiness expressing the distance between the perfect divinity and the imperfect human being under her sway, but not always able to keep his word and act in good faith. Under the reign of the two last great pontiffs, father and son, the younger of them, Mutius, being also a teacher of Cicero, This distance was reduced in a way that gave to good faith its present power in modern jurisprudence, but was resented in those days by a majority as running against their way of life, in our view, characterized by an excessive sense of freedom. Subjective fides had been transformed into objective bona fides. Its requirement, it demands, faith, were cast in the word, as between honest people, there ought to be honest dealing and no deception. Ut inter bonos bene agio oportet, et sine faulationis. In Latin, the honest people were the good, and they required the required behavior, a good one, a bene agi, the good being in Stoic teaching the highest quality attainable. Under this principle, the law of sale, which held a paradigmatic place in this debate, did no longer allow the vendor to conceal a latent defect by treating the buyer as an independent person to whom he owed nothing before entering into the contract that promised delivery. This changed. His knowledge that the house was ruinous or pestiferous was seen as an interest of the buyer that he had to reveal because good faith had made him a trustee of the buyer's interest. The underlying principle was that every other one's interest, Latin, the inter esse, which the circumstances have put into my hands, creates and imposes on me in the name of solidarity the duty of a caretaker, a trustee. It was a principle never to abandon and richly expanded in modern civil law. But nevertheless, in Roman legal history, the reason for the appearance of the third period, the skeptical one, who succeeded in abolishing its reign for a certain time. This brusque change was possible because this doctrine, another person's interest places in my hand, makes me a trustee of them, formed, as I already said, the conception of public office. So that Tiberius Gracchus, the famous tribune, with the full backing of this jurisprudence, saw himself, when elected tribune of the plebeians, it was the same year the elder Mutius became consul, as a trustee of the interest of the needy people and initiated, using to the full the means of the state treasury, a large-scale settlement project on the public land, then in factual possession of land laws, and treated a colleague who intervened against the plebiscite as someone who had forfeited his office because acting against the duty it contained. He had him accordingly removed by another plebiscite so that the intended vote could take place. When he tried to get re-elected, he was slain by his adversaries in the Senate and their followers as someone who wanted to introduce a monarchy, the gravest possible sin against the spirit of the republic imaginable. His project was nevertheless pursued because the party of the elder Mutius continued to prevail in the Senate. The result was extremely grave. The new interpretation of the office of the tribune, it's called ratio tribunatus, was resented as revolutionary and had the effect, as Cicero stated in retrospect, that there were for a long time in one republic 2 senates and almost already 2 peoples, in una republica duo senatus et duo paeniam populi. What ensued was in fact a long-lasting period of civil wars between the optimates, the party of the nobility and their clients, and the populares, the party siding with the needy, that got only a first respite with Sulla's reconstitution of the Republic that included, via edict, the enactment of a new strictly humanistic private law, that of the third period. This law was a creation of the skeptical academy, refined by Philon of Larissa, who, by the lectures he held as an exile in Rome since 88, had found immense acclaim and approval with his leading idea that revolutionized the Platonic tradition. It said, "The founder of law and civilization is the philosophically educated orator who does not believe in transcendental ideas, but in the ordering forms and values discovered by human common sense." The vast rhetorical work of Cicero and the explosion of legal literature, beginning with Servius Sulpicius, are testament to his universal success. The profound relationship between these historical figures, Servius and Cicero, friends in the same age, has been immortalized by Lord Byron's highly evocative verse, "The Roman friend of Rome's least mortal mind." Servius, the founder of the new jurisprudence, appearing here being a great lawyer as a Roman par excellence, and Cicero as a panoramic genius who in many instances had upheld the memory and glory of his friend. In the view of this jurisprudence, the purpose of the power in the hand of a magistrate is limited to the maintenance of peace and its legal aspect to the protection of the positive law, based on the principle of formal equality, which was created to overcome the pre-existing natural state held to be full of violence. There was in the office of a magistrate no more inherent empowerment that could create a duty to conduct social politics in favor of the needy, as felt by Tiberius Gracchus. This was to become an essential feature of the fourth period, characterized by the idea of a re-established republic, whereby the monarchy of the Augustan Principate recommended itself with great success. The fact under this new reign, the two imperial law schools renewed in the form of a professional competition the difference between the jurisprudence of Boetius and Servius, and did so under the official declared authority of the Princeps, did in no way weaken the new constitution. On the contrary, it reinforced it by thoroughly depoliticizing the private law. The scientific interest of the imperial jurisprudence was reduced to the task of trying to discover, through continuous discussions of numerous controversies, a sort of harmony fitting the new constitution. The praiseworthy fact that these debates were preserved in the codification of Justinian allows us, especially when we use the information provided by Cicero, to bring the opinions of both sides back to their historical origin in the two most influential philosophies of Hellenism, and follow their discussion and their results with a clear understanding. It was the great and culturally immeasurably valuable achievement of Augustus that he brought Republican tradition together when he, in a seemingly contradictory way, founded the Pax Augustea, the Augustan peace of the so-called re-established republic. That is a republic which was at the same time under an unlimited monarchical power. He achieved it first through a categorical division. The sovereign military power, of which he was the heir of Caesar, was no source of private law. Instead, the law of the depoliticized civil society, symbolized by the re-established republic, was, as I already said, was warranted solely by his authority, his auctoritas, which, as I already said, was as augural in its origin as the name Augustus. It was consequently primarily used to empower the leading lawyers of Rome to develop the law ex auctoritate principis. It was an authorization that left both traditions, continued in the two imperial law schools, complete professional freedom as to how they would try to accommodate the law they professed to the new constitution. Then it was of a paramount importance that the highest source of law, now in the hands of Augustus, was in the augural tradition intent on presenting to the divine the best legal order that humankind can achieve. This intention allowed Augustus not only to treat the two legal traditions that had on one after another formed the law of the Republic as equals, but also to regard the competing efforts as the best way to achieve what the re-established Republic promised, namely to warrant peace and well-being for the civil society of the empire. This was nevertheless a bold attitude when we look on the fundamental differences that opposed both worldviews, the skeptical tradition for mankind on its existential level, governed by nature that nature has taught to all animals, endowing them first of all with the interests of self-preservation. Whereas the other, maintaining his belief that providence wills mankind to live with the gods, that is, with the divine values, professed a spiritual nature that was always just and fair. At the end, both converged and gave to human life two different existential levels, as Augustus himself had demonstrated, showing himself without restraint as a very natural being when corresponding with Horace, but lived at the same time as a founder and guarantor of the re-established republic, also in the judgment of the same Horace, in the sphere of divine principles and duties. Gaius, a law teacher living in the time of the adaptive emperors, that is in the middle of the 2nd century, expressed the 2 levels of human existence in the title of his book, Everyday's Matter and Golden Rules. The same is visible when the law of his time ruled on the one hand that seller and purchaser are naturally allowed to overreach each other, but obliges on the other hand, observing the principle of trust, it as the responsibility for the interest of the next in a special relationship, the seller to pay full damages when he knowingly allows that the delivered good causes harm to the assets of the buyer because of the latent fault, defect that he should have declared. I can't go into further details, but I will now try to give a summary of what the spirit of the Roman law is when historically revisited. It is not, as Järing proclaimed after his turnabout, a spirit that gives the lead in law to life with whatever demands it may present itself to the decision maker. With this thesis, he replaced the exaggeration of his views when he believed unconditionally in the higher truth of the concept of the Roman law with another exaggeration, still more unfounded. Roman law is on all its 4 stages an inspiring model of the fact that the essence of law lies in its objectivity, in the reliable presence of its entitlements that provide freedom, and on the other hand, in the effectiveness of its values that guide legal behavior on the other. The framework of all was a peaceful vindication model, attributing subjective rights. It was enhanced by the Stoics that interpreted it as providential, by the skeptics that saw in it a product of human reason, and by Augustus, who acted by re-establishing the Republic as a providential politician who admitted both traditions. The same objectivity is given to values like good faith that the Stoic revered as divine, and the skeptic as a proof that in peaceful condition human beings experience the demands of legal ethics. The imperial schools tried again to give to both values its due, to human faith that requires fulfillment of a promise, and to the higher trust principle that can make us to caretakers of other people's interests that have been put into our hand. Realizing what I said, it is obvious that the spirit of the Roman law cannot be understood when approaching it with an attitude that reduces law to situational decision-making. One must, on the contrary, always keep in mind that Roman law owes its objectivity in antiquity and in modern times up to the historical law school to the fact that it did not yet divide theology, philosophy, sociology, and topology and jurisprudence into special disciplines, but saw law as a blessing it bestows on human life, as the greatest expression of all of them combined. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.